Thank you for joining us today. I'm Julie Hannes. I'm Director of Strategic and Public Interest Communications for the Institute on the Environment. And it's my honor to welcome you to this People and Planet conversation, the first one of the spring semester. We launched People and Planet in 2020 as a space to have wide-ranging conversations about the intersections of climate and the human and natural systems that shape our world. And today's conversation about evolving seasonal patterns is such a great example of this. And I would say it is not lost on me that we're gathered here today virtually. And if you're streaming from anywhere in Minnesota or the Midwest, we were setting and approaching some new record highs yesterday across the southern parts of our state. So I'm very excited, needless to say, for today's conversation. My job is to introduce our amazing moderator, Dr. Julie Etterson, who will introduce the rest of our conversation participants. First, however, I want to begin by acknowledging that our University of Minnesota system has campuses that are located on the traditional and treaty lands of Dakota and Anishinaabe peoples. And tribes were forced to cede this land, and our university, as sometimes called a land grant institution, has benefited from this dispossession. We sometimes describe our Institute on the Environment as a scholarly community committed to building a sustainable future. And saying that demands questions like, with whom, in what ways? And we believe this is complex work and it is not ours alone. And so we acknowledge both past and present injustices and the people on whose land we live, learn, and work as we seek to improve and strengthen our relations with the 11 tribal nations in Minnesota. Institutionally, also as part of the university, we acknowledge that words are not enough. Dakota, Ojibwe, and other Indigenous knowledge systems are crucial ways of knowing, and we must ensure that our university provides support, resources, and programs that increase access to all aspects of higher education for our American Indian students, staff, faculty, and community members, and this is work to which INE is committed. So I'm about to hand it off to Julie, but I have a couple quick logistical notes. If you have questions for our speakers, they are reserving some time toward the end of the discussion. So please add questions into the Zoom Q&A, and we will try to answer as many as we can. Also, we are recording this conversation, and we will share it along with any resources mentioned during the discussion in a follow-up message later this week. And so now, without further delay, the folks that you really came here to see, it is my honor and pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Dr. Julie Etterson. She is Director of the Institute on the Environment at the University of Minnesota, Duluth, and Distinguished McKnight University Professor in the UMD Department of Biology. Julie, I hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Julie. I'm really excited for this conversation today because I imagine it's going to parallel a lot of the national and regional discussions we've been having about changing winter patterns. And so I'm really excited to introduce our two speakers that'll help us delve into this topic. Dr. Jay Austin is a professor in the Department of Physics and Astronomy and is in the Large Lakes Observatory at the University of Minnesota, Duluth. And Steve Shier is the climate specialist for the 1854 Treaty Authority that is also in the city of Duluth. So welcome, Steve. Welcome, Jay. To get us started, I would appreciate it if you could tell us a little bit about you and your organization's work and how that's related to seasonal climate changes in the Midwest. Jay, do you want to start with that?
Absolutely. Thanks, Julie, and thanks to IONE for the opportunity to participate in this forum today. So I'm Jay Austin, as Julie said. I'm at the University of Minnesota, Duluth. I split my time between the physics department and the Large Lakes Observatory, and I'll talk a little bit about what that is in just a moment. My background is in oceanography. I transitioned to freshwater in around 2005, so I've been up here for close to 20 years now. My work centers around understanding what sets temperature structure in large lakes in general. And so I'm not primarily a climate scientist, but my work is very climate adjacent. In other words, what I do wouldn't look a whole lot different if the climate wasn't changing over time, but the climate is changing over time. And one of the things that responds to that are things like large lakes, which are these big, important ecosystems where many, many processes are temperature dependent. And so it's important for us to understand those sorts of things. I'll point out I'm also the director of the Water Resources Science program here at the University of Minnesota Duluth, which is a joint program with the Twin Cities campus. I'll say one more thing, which is the Large Lakes Observatory is a group of researchers on campus who have as their mission the understanding of large lakes around the world. So not management or restoration, but understanding the fundamental science that governs how big lakes, not just here in the upper Midwest, but around the globe, how they function. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Steve. Jay, sorry. Steve, do you want to tell us a little bit about you and your organization's work?
Yeah, thanks, Julie. I'm happy to be here. Hi, everybody. My name is Steve Shier. I'm the climate specialist for the 1854 Treaty Authority here in Duluth. If you're not aware, the 1854 Treaty Authority is an intertribal organization between Bois Forte and Grand Portage bands of Ojibwe, located in the Arrowhead region of Northeast Minnesota. We work to protect and preserve the off-treaty reservation rights for those bands. Yeah, a little bit about myself. Climate is actually a newer field of study for me. Previously, I was a fish biologist for many years, working throughout the Midwest, a lot of aquatic invasive species work and stuff like that. But my main responsibility here at the authority is implementing our climate adaptation and climate adaptation plan, which we created in 2016. Working with our environmental biologists, we do a lot of long-term environmental monitoring, looking at lake temperatures, snowpack, ice depth, a lot of things like that throughout the ceded territories. Additionally, we're doing some projects here. We have in-house fish and wildlife biologists. We're working on doing some climate research there as well.
All right, thank you so much for that. So how have you seen winter landscapes changing over time? Steve, you want to take that question first?
Yeah, that's actually an interesting question because I'm a fairly recent transplant to the Duluth area. I'm originally from the UP, Marquette, Michigan. But already I've, seen a lot of interesting weather going on in the last couple of years here. It's been interesting going from last year with record snowfall and everything like that to this year where we have no snow to begin with. It's interesting to see all the severe drought that's happening and then the floods that also occur in the same years. And if I'm correct, this is like Duluth's second warmest winter on record at the moment. So yeah, it's been an interesting couple of years.
All right, thank you. Jay, observations about how the winter landscape's changing?
Sure, and I'll take this from the perspective of ice on the Great Lakes, because I think that's something that we're all sort of really very well aware of. And there's been a lot of attention around the fact that the Great Lakes, in general, and Lake Superior as well, no exception, are experiencing either record or near record low ice levels this year. That's not to say, this is a long-term trend. We've seen a lot of these very low ice years, especially since about 1998. Doesn't mean that we're not going to see ice on the lakes ever again. 2014, the polar vortex year, still stands out as the heaviest ice cover year we've seen on the lakes in the instrumental record. But we're seeing more and more of these very low ice years. 2012 was the previous sort of my gold standard for what a low ice year looked like. But this year is actually, we're running warmer air temperatures so far and roughly the same ice cover. So basically the ice cover on Superior right now is confined to fringing bays like Black Bay or Nipigon Bay, the Duluth Superior Harbor, Schwamigan Bay. rather than the open waters of the lake. And so the interesting thing, I think what we'll be discussing here, what are the implications of those reduced ice covers?
Mm-hmm. And so what is the data telling you about these changes in relation to seasonal phenology, Jay?
Sure. So it turns out that we can actually define seasons in quotes in lakes fairly specifically by how lakes are setting themselves up, how the temperature is being distributed. In the summer and in the winter, we tend to have layers of temperature, differing temperature. In the summer, it's warm water sitting on top of cool water. In the winter, cold water sitting on top of very slightly warmer water. And then we have these shoulder seasons where the lakes are well mixed. And we can look at when those seasons start and when they end. And what we've observed, not just over the last 30 or 40 years, but over the last century, we have ways of looking at the length of those seasons. And they have increased appreciably. The summer season is on the order of a month longer now than it was a century ago. And there are lots of downstream implications of that.
Steve, do you have other information that you can tell us about how the changes that you're observing are affecting seasonal phenology?
Yeah, actually, so kind of to piggyback off of some of Jay's statements, we're seeing within, inland lakes and stuff, ice cover is down. You don't want to draw too many conclusions from a very small data set, but from our monitoring since 2016, we're already seeing ice depth across the Arrowhead region is down inches. A lot of that is just kind of following the global trend of warmer, wetter years, less snow and ice cover and stuff like that in earlier springs. A lot of change that is concerning to band members is the change in maple syrup, which some may already be tapping. I've heard of people tapping, at the end of January in some instances, and it's kind of an anecdotal thing that kind of resonated with me. We were just doing some ice surveys a couple weeks ago, and we watched two snowshoe hares that were completely white running across a gray field. That was a very stark contrast that kind of stuck out.
Okay, thank you so much. And so can you tell us a bit about the specific challenges that are the evolving winter patterns pose to both the environment and our communities? Either one of you could go. Jay, you want to take that one?
So loss of ice on Superior and the other Great Lakes has implications on a wide range of topics. So from an ecological perspective, ice provides critical spawning habitat for fish in coastal regions. And so the loss of that ice threatens that sort of process. Ice provides armor in some sense against winter storms. And so as we see lower ice levels, we can expect coastal erosion to increase in regions where we have soft shorelines, like the Wisconsin shoreline here near Duluth. Mm-hmm. Beyond the sort of ecological or geological implications, though, there are sort of commercial and cultural implications of this loss of ice. And so ice is one of the things that sort of defines where we are. It makes Superior different in some sense. And so I'll point out that Superior, more than the other Great Lakes, has tremendous variability in the amount of ice that forms. And so we have some years like 2014 or 2015 where we have these very, very heavy ice cover years. Other years like this year, 2012, 2020, where we see very little ice. The other Great Lakes tend to be like Erie is almost always has very robust cover. Ontario, Michigan, Huron, not very much ice forms. And so we're going to be moving again into an era with less of this ice cover. And it's going to change our perception of the world that we live in up here in the Northland. And so recreational activities like visiting the ice caves or ice fishing off of the beaches here in Duluth. When we have a good hard freeze, you'll often see people out skating. But there are also commercial implications that impact on shipping seasons. And there's been a lot of talk about whether reduced ice may in the future lead to a longer shipping season or a shorter layup season for the shipping industry. That I would say that the loss of ice is a giant price to pay for a very small payoff there. I had something else. I'll hand it over to Steve.
Okay, yeah, Steve, same question. Challenges that the evolving winter patterns are posing to the environment and people?
Yeah, so I mean, shifting seasons create a lot of concerns for our native communities here in Minnesota and, throughout the Midwest. Like, for instance, moose are already on their southern range, the edge of their southern range, and dealing with a lot of stressors from reduced snowpack and, increasing winter temperatures and stuff like that. Heat stress is a big factor in the nutrition of moose. Like, as moose get heat stress, they eat less and they're less robust. Their ability to withstand tick infestations decreases. Additionally, like, as winters warm, the ability for ticks to survive through the winter and remove themselves from moose is a large concern for us here. As well as a loss of snowpack for wolf predation on calves during the winter is of increasing concern. Outside of moose, wild rice production is now seeing there's some research showing that ice cover during the winter is important for wild rice production. It's an important part of the germination phase, and hopefully some more evidence of that will come out soon. And then just kind of like economically and everything, loss of ice cover for tribes is going to be important, loss of spearing, loss of winter netting, and the impact that has on like the bands. Because when you think about bands and tribal communities, like they can't migrate like, somebody from the East Coast coming to Duluth, as, we were seeing, or the West Coast, the California rush to Duluth for the climate haven. They're tied to where they are and they can't leave, and that's important for their off reservation treaty rights. So yeah, just a couple things to think about.
Yeah, so
Can I add? I thought of what I had in my head earlier.
Yeah.
One of the things that my lab works on especially are understanding seasonal connectivity, how the character of the lake in one season ends up influencing the lake later in time. And it turns out that ice is a really, really strong predictor of what happens the following summer. And ice may not be necessarily the driving dynamic agent of that. We think that at this stage, it's more the heat stored in the water below the ice. But if we have a high ice year, that tends to portend for a later onset of summer and cooler summer water temperatures, whereas the low ice years that we're seeing right now tend to result in an earlier onset of summer conditions, warmer summer water temperatures. And you might say, well, that's great if I want to go down to Brighton Beach and go for a swim, but those warmer water temperatures have recently been implicated in the occurrence of algal blooms on the Wisconsin South Shore. And so we're seeing in these low ice years tend to foretell years where we're going to start seeing these algal blooms. In addition, things like beach advisories can be exacerbated by the things that lead to beach advisories, I should say, tend to be exacerbated by those warmer waters. And so it's not just what's happening in the winter that should be concerning us. It's that these warmer winters are leading to very, very different summers in Lake Superior and other of the Great Lakes.
Great. Thank you for that addition. So Steve, I'm going to pass it to you. Can you tell us about what research initiatives you have ongoing or are needed for us to better understand the impacts of climate change around Lake Superior and the Ceded Territory?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, climate change is fairly newer topic here at the authority. Since 2016, taking a deep involvement in environmental monitoring and stuff like that. So a lot of the things that we focus on are species and beings and or resources that are important to the bands. So we do a lot of snowpack monitoring throughout Moose Range in the in the northern part of the Arrowhead. We monitor ice cover and temp and DO water quality on like walleye lakes. As I kind of briefly mentioned, looking at like ice interactions and wilder ice production is a newer thing that we are trying to get our toes into. And then just kind of looking future, we're looking at doing trying to better understand and characterize changes in streams throughout the Ceded Territory and how that affects brook trout in the future. We do have a small component of lake sturgeon recruitment and monitoring in Lake Superior, but we do a lot of that in partnership with other organizations.
Okay, great, thanks. How about you, Jay? Research initiatives to better understand the impacts of climate change?
Sure. So, and I'll talk about sort of research on winter conditions in general on the Great Lakes. There's a really strong seasonal bias in how we study the Great Lakes. We know a fair amount about what goes on out there in the summer, and very, very little about what goes on in the winter. And there are a number of reasons for this. One is just accessibility. We don't have boats hardened to get us out onto the open waters of these lakes once harbors are iced over, and so we can't get them. The people who study the Great Lakes are largely academics, and they are teaching or have other obligations on campus during the winter, which makes it difficult, or their students who are taking classes. It makes it difficult for them to get out to do that sort of work. And there's also been this sort of long-term, maybe stereotype is not the right word, but something like that, where when lakes are cold, the biology must be boring because everything just sort of goes to sleep and there's not a lot of productivity. So let's not worry about putting a lot of effort into studying the lakes. And so there's been, over the last 5 years to a decade, this real understanding that we are falling short on our understanding of these lakes in the winter. And a number of different groups have formed to try to address this. And I'll mention two of them really quickly. One is there's an organization called the International Joint Commission, the IJC, which is a binational governing body that deals with water as it pertains to the US-Canada border. And obviously, the Great Lakes play a huge role in that, this huge resource that's shared between these two countries. They've recently concluded a set of workshops that I participated in, trying to understand what our knowledge gaps are and how we can start to address those. And it's hard, understanding who's going to fund that work for us. And so right now, the sort of long-term monitoring of the Great Lakes that the Environmental Protection Agency does, I'll talk on this side of the border for now, they do 2 system-wide cruises, one in May and one in August, give or take, August, September. And that is the only sort of legislated monitoring that we do where we're doing something very thorough across the Great Lakes. And I like to liken that to walking outside my house in Duluth twice per year and measuring the temperature and thinking that I'm going to learn anything about what the climate in Duluth is like or how it's changing over time. And so I applaud the fact that we're doing those, but it's really not up to where we need to be. The other group is a sort of informal group called Great Lakes Winter, which is a group of academics across the Great Lakes, actually led by one of my colleagues here at the Large Lakes Observatory, to, again, develop strategies to address what we do in the winter. Right now, what they're doing are these projects called winter grabs, where people are going out in coastal environments and taking a standardized set of samples and trying to develop a better understanding, at least in coastal regions, of what's going on in the winter. So we have, as a community, realized that we are falling short, and there are various groups that are pushing forward hard to try to bridge that gap.
Thank you so much. So monitoring, especially in the winter time, is something that would sort of flesh out our understanding of what's happening in the lakes and surrounding areas. Steve, can you just give us further insight into the value of monitoring and collecting long-term data, especially as it relates to winter climate patterns in the upper Midwest?
Yeah, and it's we have a new program basically. 8 years in the grand scheme of things is baby steps for a new program. Um, the federal government puts out climate normals that are 30 years long, just to compare your annual changes. But I guess when I think about long-term monitoring, I think it's invaluable. When long-term data allows us to create a clearer picture of where we were and where we're going. I guess one way you can think about it is you can kind of think of it like a digital picture. Back when AOL dial-up was a thing, you're looking at a small picture that takes minutes to come put together. And then nowadays we're living in the 4K ultra HD imagery years, and just kind of like thinking of that way. Past data feeds into future predictions, and more robust data creates better predictions for what's to come. So yeah, I think long-term data is sometimes given a dirty look, but I think it's a necessary component to figure out where we're going.
Mm-hmm. All right, that's so great. Any other comments you'd like to make, Jay, about the value of long-term monitoring?
So we just don't have a huge number of long-term data sets for the Laurentian Great Lakes. Other than we understand lake level very well. That goes back through 1860 or something like that. I was just working with students this morning on data sets that are over 150 years long. The reason we collect those is because it's important for commerce. If you want to get your boat in or out of a harbor, you need to know something about lake level. So the government has poured a huge amount of effort into that over more than a century. Ice cover records go back through the mid-70s, but measuring temperature at the surface or through the water column really only started on a regular basis in the 80s or 90s. And so groups like the Great Lakes Environmental Research Laboratory in Ann Arbor has a record in Michigan going back to the early 90s. My lab puts stuff out and leaves it out over winter to learn about how the lakes are behaving, at least from a temperature standpoint. And we've been doing that since the mid-2000s. And those represent the longest time series anywhere in the Great Lakes. And so we really are living in a bit of a data vacuum. There are very few of these long-term time series. And as soon as you start talking about something like biology or ecosystem parameters, it's very, very sparse, the data that we have.
Okay, thank you so much. So looking ahead, what are the key considerations and strategies for communities to prepare for and adapt to continuing changes in the winter environment? Steve, you want to take that one first?
Yeah, sure. Caveat, I'm not a city planner or an engineer, but I think adaptability, planning, and if as future proofing as much as possible are necessary. Infrastructure, nowadays you're seeing planning, 500 to 1,000 year storms for culverts and stuff like that. Investments in independent energy infrastructure like solar and wind, to offset and replace fossil fuel usage and mitigate energy interruptions. And something that comes to mind is like Texas big problem that they had an independent they didn't have the contingency plans for a large winter storm event, and that was very dangerous. Giving thoughts towards climate migration, kind of something I've seen is I've met a lot of people that have moved from California to Duluth. It's actually been very interesting, and I was just talking to somebody a couple of weeks ago that they saw Duluth in the news and they moved to Duluth from California. So just kind of giving thoughts towards climate migration and what that means for what our current infrastructure can handle. Cooperation and coordination between communities, I think, can't be overstated. Pooled resources. Example being right now, there's in the works a regional resilience advisory group for the Arrowhead between the counties and tribal government and the cities and towns. And I think some things like that for, smaller communities with less economic viability, can come together and pool resources and stuff like that.
Jay, can you tell us about other potential solutions that are being explored?
That's a really hard question for things on this scale. And so ice formation, and again, ice is not the only indicator of change in the Great Lakes, but it's one that I spend a lot of time thinking about. And so I'm sort of using that as a central theme here. Ice formation is a very, very strong function of winter air temperature, which is not rocket science, right? We have a colder winter, we have more ice formation. There's very little we can do regionally to address that. And I agree with all the things Steve says, but winters are not warmer up here because of what we are doing up here. It's because of what we are doing as a planet. And so there's very little we can do regionally to forestall the loss of ice on the Great Lakes. This has to be a global effort. And whether that occurs or not, is a complicated political question. We are only starting to think about what adaptation is going to look like for the Great Lakes. And I don't think we have any great real predictions of what the lakes are going to look like in 50 years, other than we're going to have a lot more years like this year, where we see very little ice, and fewer years like 2 or 3 winters ago, or 2014, 2009, where we had really significant ice on the lakes. And so I don't know at this stage what that's going to imply for how we perceive our surroundings, our place here in the north, as we go to an era where we're going to see very little ice in a typical year. Mm-hmm. So I don't have a great answer for that one, because it's hard to understand. Other than we're going to need to figure out how to adapt to this.
Yeah, and it is a global challenge. And one of the people who's listening to this webinar asked more about the relationship with the border in Canada. What is happening on the Canadian side? Are there partnerships across the border? Yep. Are there collaborations across the border?
Yeah. Oh, sure. I was actually just at a workshop in Windsor, Ontario, 2 or 3 weeks ago, which was put on by the International Joint Commission. And the people running those were a pair of Canadian academics. And so there is a real focus on making sure that at these sorts of meetings, that there's representation from both north and south of the border. And so, yeah, there are Canadian researchers that are just as concerned and interested in these problems as people on the U.S. side. Okay. It's going to be addressing this is going to have to be a binational effort.
Mm-hmm. Steve, do you have any other comments about U.S. Canadian collaboration?
I don't really. We don't work too much with outside governments, but yeah, to reiterate, Jay, there is a lot of intergovernment agreements between Ontario and the United States for Great Lakes issues.
So Steve, one of the attendees has been tapping maple trees in the Southeast River Valley for a few weeks now. And they're wondering about whether we need to be concerned about the tree health, taking their internal energy resources, whether or not that weakens the tree and makes them more susceptible to diseases. Can you make a comment about that?
Yeah, that's a tough thing to respond to. There's a lot of concern here with us and within the bands that, the maple is running now. If we don't tap now, then there's no maple season anymore. But what that means, ecologically, and what to the trees themselves. That I can't personally speak to. I think that's an ongoing conversation. That is a tough subject to tackle. I think if a good resource would be the Clocate Forestry Center. If you have any specific University of Minnesota, they have a lot of smart people over there that might be able to help you out with that question.
Okay, that's great. I'm going to ask you another question that comes from the audience about what people can do, lay people can do to help protect urban trees or small woodlands on their property. What should they be looking for? And where can they go for help or technical support? Do you have suggestions there?
Yeah, I think I'm a fish guy. I'm a water science kind of person. I don't have too much terrestrial knowledge, but again, I can't reiterate enough. The Cloquet Forestry Center, they have a lot of resources there through the University of Minnesota. Um, a lot of great people, and I know this doesn't really directly answer the question, but they are putting together, a climate action and urban planning, and that's something that's in active conversations with. So yeah, sorry, I can't give a better answer than that.
That's great. I'm going to switch over to you, Jay. There's a fair bit of interest around algae blooms. Can you talk about algae that's endemic and whether they're causing the problem in Lake Superior? What's going on, and what are the implications of algal blooms?
So this is a really interesting and very contemporary topic. I think 10 years from now, nobody was talking about algal blooms in Lake Superior. And so this is a relatively recent phenomenon. I'm not an algal biologist, I'm a physicist, but I sit across the hall from Bob Sterner, who does a lot of work with understanding what are driving these algal blooms. So far, my understanding, and so we see these algal blooms on the South Shore, so the sort of Port Wing area, between Superior and the Apostle Islands. We are seeing them more and more often. We have no way of knowing whether they were there before and we simply didn't see them. And so a lot of this is sort of anecdotal evidence, but we do tend to see them in warmer years. And we tend to see them in years where we have a lot of precipitation in that region. And so people like Bob Sterner here at LLO, Kate Reinl, who's over at the Lake Superior National Estuarine Research Reserve in Superior, and a lot of people from like the Wisconsin DNR, other organizations, the Park Service are very, very concerned about this, are trying to understand what the things are that are driving these systems. Did I just say this? So far, what we've seen are mostly what we call nuisance algal blooms, where you really wouldn't want to go swimming. But we haven't, as far as I understand, gotten to the point where we have harmful algal blooms where, just being in the water or maybe your dog is in the water could cause, serious health problems or even death in some cases. That is different than Lake Erie, for instance, where they have persistent algal blooms that are sort of predictable every year. We haven't gotten to that stage in Superior, largely because we don't have the agricultural footprint that you do within the Erie watershed, the Maumee River and Toledo River.
Steve, how about inland lakes and algal blooms? Are they increasing in frequency and abundance?
Yeah, so harmful algal blooms is kind of new to us within the last year. There's been conversations about it. We don't have any direct monitoring of algal blooms, but it is something that we are concerned about. Not for any specific reasons, but I just for a lack of knowledge and understanding for inland lakes, and the interactions with the communities and the access to the lakes within the Arrowhead and stuff like that. So we're looking at doing some monitoring ourselves, but again, yeah, nothing solid.
So here is more of a general question. In the circles where you travel, I'm wondering whether or not you're noticing whether people in Duluth or in the Arrowhead region are just having more conversations about climate this winter. Maybe
if
Go
you
ahead.
talk to my, cross-country skiing friends, they're certainly having this conversation right now. And so we went from a warm, very wet winter last winter to a warm, very dry winter this year. I know from my perspective, there is an enormous amount of interest in the media around what is going on, what is driving this, and what the implications are. So yeah, there's a lot more conversation around this at this stage.
Yeah, and I think not to step in, but like the concern is growing. So like I think the conversations are increasing, and people are curious. I mean, we're hitting record-setting temperatures that we've never seen before, especially within some younger generations. And it's interesting. I've been involved in a lot of like panels and discussions with other organizations, and there's there's groups in high school now that are like youth climate advocacy groups. And when I was in high school, that climate change was never on my radar. You know what I mean? It was like getting my homework done in grades and, how much fun I was going to have on the weekend with my friends. And now you've got 16-year-olds talking about how climate change is going to affect them within the next 10, 20, 30 years. And that just like is mind boggling. So, yeah, I think, the awareness and conversations are only going to get louder and, more robust at this point.
Great. And so for the young people out there who are, really interested and committed, dedicated to making an impact on climate change, can you give us some idea of where you think those people will be most needed in the next 10 to 15 years, as it relates to tackling climate change or other related environmental problems?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think, small change occurs at the local level, but change has to happen at the national level. So getting people that are comfortable publicly speaking and engagements in advocacy groups and, getting involved in, the political process, I think is, maybe a lot of people don't want to hear that, but getting youth involved and engaged and getting them on board with what needs to occur and moving forward is paramount. I think at this point, I'm 40 and should have been doing this 20 years ago, and now I'm doing it, but it's better late than never, I guess. So yeah, getting engagement and getting involved is where I see us going from here.
Yeah. Jay, valuable career paths
Sure.
for
So,
young people?
The International Joint Commission, I've mentioned them several times so far. They recently released their decadal science plan. So in other words, what are the priorities for the Great Lakes? What do we need? What do we need to do? And one of their, I think they had 5 like executive summary bullet points, and one of them was workforce development. We need to be making sure that we're training people that will be the next generation of water scientists. I should really put in a plug for the Water Resources Science Program, which is, I think one of the things that the University of Minnesota as a whole does really well is a real commitment to understanding our water resources, not just in our state, but globally. And so yeah, my background originally as an undergraduate was not in environmental science or something like that. I did degrees in physics and math, but having those really fundamental building blocks are really necessary for building up the sort of scientific infrastructure that we have. Beyond that, we need to understand better how to bridge the gap between sort of academic scientists like myself and the public. And so we have organizations like Sea Grant here, Minnesota Sea Grant, whose mission is to act as this conduit from academic scientists who frequently are not great communicators, getting that information out to the public. And so Sea Grant helps to sort of smooth out our message and make it not palatable, but understandable to people who don't necessarily have some funny academic background.
Yeah, so just following up on that, what are the arguments that you think regular people should have in their back pocket when this topic comes up, when they're talking about winter weather? Can you give us an idea of like the condensed ideas that you would share, the messages that you think have really good traction?
Mm-hmm.
Well, go ahead, Jay.
So this is a sort of an anecdote is the wrong word, but this is my elevator speech really quickly. When we try to communicate climate change to the public, the numbers that we talk about often sound really small. It's going to be a degree or 2 degrees or 3 degrees warmer by the end of the century. And it's really easy, I think, for someone to say, well, why should I care, right? Because it was 10 degrees colder yesterday, and it's going to be 15 degrees warmer tomorrow. So why do I care about, 2 or 3 degree temperature difference? The answer is a system like Lake Superior is really sensitive to those very small changes in temperature. And so the difference between a year where people are out ice fishing off of Brighton Beach and going and visiting the ice caves down near Bayfield, or the shipping season is impacted, the difference between one of those years and a year like this year, where there's essentially nothing going on the lake with regards to ice cover, are due to differences in winter air temperature on the order of just a few degrees Fahrenheit. And so we live in a world of these systems that are just extremely sensitive to these small changes. And just because a change over time sounds small doesn't mean the implications aren't going to be. Or it doesn't mean the downstream effects of those small changes are going to be minor, because we live on a system that is very, very sensitive to these small changes.
Thank you so much, Steve. Do you have back pocket messages that you like to pull out in daily conversations?
Yeah, and kind of just following off what Jay said, as scientists, we love data, right? We love numbers, we love spreadsheets, we love trends. And to public people that may not be interested in science, that's not very interesting and not engaging. I think if you can't see any changes occurring within the last 2 years, even in the Duluth region, then you're not paying attention, I don't think. So just having personal impacts, you could talk to fishermen, like, what is climate change meaning on a local scale for their walleye populations? And, like, how is that going to impact them? And yeah, I struggle with it a little bit because, looking out 50 years, 100 years, like, there's some scary things on the horizon way out there, but also trying to be like, we can offset that, we can change, we just need to change and create that change. So I think just having real conversations, person to person, with personal impacts is a good start.
Okay, thank you so much for that. What about monitoring? If we can go back to that question a little bit, are there, things that citizen scientists can observe that are helpful for filling in the gaps of our understanding? What are other sort of indicators or proxies or helpful information that we can all be attuned to and perhaps could contribute?
Right. So I would say that Lake Superior itself is not perhaps particularly amenable to citizen science. It's not a great place to be in the winter. There are certainly opportunities in seasons where it's a little safer to be out there. I know that there is a group called the Minnesota Phenology Network. Phenology is a term that refers to seasonality. In other words, when's the first robin of spring, or when do you see lilacs bloom, or when do you see the first snowfall? And so there are networks in the region that keep track of these sorts of indicators. And so one thing that citizen scientists can do, or people who have a deep interest in this, is to get involved in organizations. Julie, you probably know more about the Minnesota Phenology Network than I do, but
Uh,
I think that's a fantastic
yeah.
resource for doing citizen science. Maybe you can comment on that.
Well, Jessica Savage, who is at the University of Minnesota Duluth in the Department of Biology, was critical in establishing that program. And it is citizens who agree to do regular checks on local trees, sometimes in parks, sometimes in their own neighborhood, to help us try to understand how the climate is influencing the timing of events that happen in the normal life cycle of a tree. And so I would definitely check Dr. Savage's website for more information about that. Steve, did you have other thoughts on monitoring?
Yeah, I think one thing that immediately comes to mind that we're a part of here is COCORAHS, COCORAHS. It is a national volunteer-based, data collection service. And it's interesting how much you can do literally with a rain gauge, a ruler, and a thermometer. You know what I mean? Like you can monitor precipitation and temperature literally off your back porch. And we do that here, and they do it nationally. And I think like you can just see the change for yourself, I think. So just a shout out to Coco Raz. If you feel interested, check it out.
Jay?
One thing I've wanted to do for a long time, and maybe this is being done at some level, is to harness our tremendous array of ice anglers in Minnesota to develop a better understanding of how ice thickness develops on small lakes. If I hired a graduate student to study ice thickness on lakes, it would be unbelievably expensive to collect data from just a few lakes. Whereas we have people out there who are making, who are whether they know it or not, making measurements of ice thickness on many, many lakes across the state on a very regular basis. And so maybe some effort could be put into figuring out how to communicate with that particular constituency to develop a better network of understanding there.
So maybe just one more question. Can each of you provide examples of the type of transformational adaptation needs that are going to be required into the future for us to contend with climate change in the systems where you study and work? Steve?
Transformational adaptation. That's a big question. I think adaptation. Adaptation is going forward is paramount. It's food sovereignty, solar panel construction, the just changing your reliances now for things that might not be there in the future. Some interesting things that are happening, like specifically, if things don't change, moose are potentially going to be gone in 50 years or maybe even less, depending on how things go. But we're now bringing Fond du Lac Band is working on bringing elk in as a substitute species, as a subsistence harvest thing. Grand Portage is bringing in buffalo instead of moose. I think adaptability is going to be key to going forward.
Jay?
I'm not sure how much I have to add there. Yeah, I think just a realization that years like this are no longer going to be the exception, right? Is understanding that this is now the world we live in. It's going to change the ecosystem. It's going to change commerce. It's going to change how we relate to the lake. Again, we'll still have the occasional high ice year, but we're entering a new era at this stage where this is the rule, not the exception.
So are there impacts that you'll be keeping an eye on throughout this year that might be linked to the mild winter across the region?
Sure. I mean, just meeting with people yesterday, people are already gearing up for doing proper observations of these transient algal blooms on the South Shore. And so there's continued interest, and we have a great warning that this is going to be a year to look for these, because we know that these warm winters tend to precede those sorts of things. And obviously, I'm keeping track of understanding how the lake is responding thermally to that, but that's a little more esoteric than algal blooms that are affecting, for instance, recreation on the South Shore.
All right, thank you all for your questions. We're nearing our time today, and I want to give the panelists a chance to share one final thought or takeaway from the discussion today. Either one of you.
This is a really interesting time to be studying climate change, where we can see it going on really all around us. And so, like I said before, my work is more climate adjacent than it is, directly climate change focused. But it's very difficult at this stage not to just look at variability from year to year, but start looking and understanding the trends and what those trends imply for us.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting growing up and having climate change on the horizon. Now it's basically at the doorstep, and just kind of coming to terms with that. And I just kind of would like to think, get involved, go to city council meetings, go voice your concerns when things come up. And I think really just getting everybody talking about it in the first place is a step in the right direction.
Thank you both for your contributions today. So interesting to hear your perspectives on the impacts and the ways in which you are contributing to the body of knowledge that's going to help us find solutions for the future. So thank you very much.